Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome back to the Future of Urban AI. This is, I believe, our 7th session. So we'll have 3 more, and then we'll have to think about the second season. So maybe we'll leave this one on a cliffhanger, as is the style these days. Just on that theme, if you're interested in binge watching all of the recordings of the events to date, those are available on the Urban AI YouTube channel, and we can share those coordinates in the chat. As you recall, this whole series is an exploration of a 10-year forecast that was published by Cornell Tech last year, called The Future of Urban Tech. It's at thefutureofurbantech.org. And what we did to develop the content was to kind of thread a journey through this map, skipping across the hotspots where AI is really playing an instrumental role in shaping the future of cities and technology in cities. And the forecast is organized around 6 big picture forecasts. So these are the stories that you might wake up 10 years from now and find on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, really describing the big shifts that have happened and that are affecting everybody, whether they're in industry, government, or the nonprofit sector. And so we've moved through a couple of these so far: supercharged infrastructure, wild and well. We've talked about dark plans, New Green Deal. And this session is going to focus on the forecast around urban innovation industrializes, which summarized in this headline: big business cracks the code of the city. If you were lucky enough to come to Cornell Tech's Urban Tech Summit last week, you would have seen a great fireside chat we had with Josh O'Kane, a reporter for the Globe and Mail in Toronto, who has just published a book called Sideways, the City That Google Couldn't Buy, which was about the one attempt of big business to crack the code of the city at the Sidewalk Toronto development project, which kind of failed spectacularly after a 5-year run. And so this is kind of a hopeful forecast in some ways, if you're in industry, in big business. But I think what we've seen, even as some of those high-profile attempts by tech giants to get into the business of urban tech have not gone so well, that we've seen like a really broad and grassroots campaign, I think, to develop innovations in urban tech and to bring them not just to city governments, but to people who own, companies that own commercial property, in housing markets, in different verticals of infrastructure. And to me, that's really, I think, where the excitement is coming from. And so today, we are bringing to you a perspective of someone who I think is really focused on how to drive innovation through private enterprise, often in partnership with government and aligned with policy that government is trying to advance, and really deliver the solutions that we need as we face all the challenges that cities face. Paul Healy, who's our guest today, he's a principal at Commonweal Ventures. He leads diligence in potential investments, supports portfolio companies, and manages the firm's operations. And prior to joining Commonweal, Paul was an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company, where he led projects for state and local government clients on economic development and infrastructure topics. He's also advised investors, startup founders, and candidates for elected office on these topics. Paul has a law degree from Yale School, a master's in economics from Oxford University, and a BA from Georgetown Economics and Classics. And I think Paul is really, someone who is on the ground, understands, both what innovators and investors and people who are steering our public sector need, and how to try to line those up. So Paul, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so presentation should be working now. Great. So thanks again for the introduction, Anthony. Great to be with you all today. Excited for the conversation. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of background about myself and our firm and kind of where we fit into the broader innovation ecosystem. Then I'm going to discuss some trends we're seeing in a few different pieces of the urban landscape where AI is kind of maturing and coming to market, and then open it up for discussion with some broader reflections and questions for the group. So I am a principal at Commonweal Ventures. We're an early stage VC firm based here in New York. We invest in seed and Series A companies in a few big verticals that you see on the page here. These are important sectors of the economy where public investment and shifts in public policy are creating enormous opportunities for private sector innovation over the next decade or so, as we as a planet and as a country in the US strive to drastically reduce carbon emissions and upgrade our infrastructure. So we think this coming decade is going to be huge for these sectors, and it's going to take a navigation of the political system, regulatory system, as well as tech innovation, and that's kind of where we fit in as a firm. So just to give you an example of some specific investment theses that we're pursuing under these verticals, we've been very excited about decarbonization in the built environment. We've invested in one software company that does this, called Enertiv, provide software to commercial real estate buildings to help them monitor and decrease energy usage. We've also been looking very intently at residential electrification. That's a place where there's a lot of tech coordination and kind of more sophisticated forms of data integration analytics that are going to be needed to build the next generation power grid as energy generation becomes more diverse and distributed, and consumption needs to adjust in real time. So those are some of the types of markets and businesses we look at. And then just a little bit about what makes us different. Anthony kind of alluded to this, but we're different from a lot of other VC investors because politics and public policy is really in our firm's DNA. So our core investment team, as well as our group of advisors, of which our esteemed host today, Anthony Townsend, is one. We're all people who have spent time working in both the private sector and public sector and know how to navigate between them. So where other investors might be scared off, by a regulatory dimension to a certain business, that gets us excited because that's a place where we can add value. So we have a deep bench of advisors, including people like former CTOs or deputy mayors of big cities, former appointed officials in the federal government, and so on, and we can kind of call on them on a case-by-case basis. So that's just a little bit of context about why I'm here speaking with you today. So to kind of move into the discussion very quickly, to kind of set our terms and set the scope, I'm sure this definition of AI is common knowledge and kind of a consensus one for the folks on the call today, but just to I know the phrase can get thrown around with some imprecision, certainly. So just to get very tangible about it from my perspective, at least in terms of what's in and what's out. So in the urban context, for example, using machine learning to analyze massive amounts of data about people's driving patterns to predict damage to roads and proactively conduct maintenance. That would be, an application of AI, whereas other deployments of technology, like automating speed ticket enforcement, just automating that process, you're using technology, but you're just detecting whether some object is going above or below some speed threshold. There's not necessarily a dynamic learning process. That would not be AI. So just to briefly kind of set the terms there. And then in terms of the urban landscape, obviously, for those of us who live in cities, all of human life and natural life, occurs in cities. I'm gonna keep the discussion today limited to basically the verticals that we invest in that you saw on a couple pages ago. Primarily, the built environment, mobility, energy, and related government services. That's what we spend all day, every day looking at and what we know best. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So first, I would assert that artificial intelligence has transformed life in cities less than it's transformed other important facets of our economy, like commerce and the way big businesses are run. And I think in his intro, Anthony obviously referred to the Toronto waterfront project. That's probably one of the most well-covered examples of a sort of failure of AI in a big city. A few others I have on the slide here, and there are sensible reasons for many of these failures, including, of course, that in the Toronto case, and the Boston City Council example here of banning facial surveillance technology. There's a higher level of public accountability and scrutiny and kind of community pushback, which in many cases is good. We want obviously we want democratic input and pushback when technology is not being deployed in ways that's consistent with our norms or values. And then I think there's a more structural explanation, which is like deploying AI in cities almost necessarily interacts with like physical assets of some sort in most use cases in a way that's sort of not quite true for like an Amazon or Spotify recommendation algorithm or something like that. So I think it's those reasons have combined to sort of delay some of maybe the rapid radical transformations we all might have imagined 5, 10, 15 years ago. But I think there's a serious case to be made that we are on the cusp of a massive wave that could change this, as several factors combine to make this moment and probably the next 5 to 10 years, we'd like to think, really quite different from the last decade or so in terms of AI deployment in these sectors. So before I get into a few specific companies that I want to highlight, on the right side of this page, I think there are some structural tailwinds that have combined at the right moment here to set us up for what we're seeing. So, first of all, in the US at least, we have several enormous pieces of federal legislation that are deploying historic amounts of money into broadly the sectors we're talking about, right? Like built environment, infrastructure, climate. And so giant streams of public funding like that will necessarily in many cases kind of crowd in private investment as large projects can be made more efficient, can be managed more effectively, and so on. In addition to just pure funding streams, there are a lot of, when you dig in at the sort of sector and subsector level, there are a lot of really interesting kind of mandates that create new markets in the form of federal, state, and local regulatory changes. And there are just hundreds or probably even more of these. A couple prominent ones that we've been looking at recently are FERC Order 2222, which was made regulation a couple years ago, is out now in the process of being implemented relatively slowly, but nonetheless is rolling out. And this regulation at the federal level mandates that regional grid operators across the US allow distributed energy resource aggregators to access wholesale energy markets. And so this is creating enormous opportunity for sophisticated tech solutions that can basically manage and optimize that aggregation process and the transacting that will have to happen between distributed energy resources and the grid, which should ultimately create a more resilient, adaptive grid, but nonetheless will require a lot of innovation. Here in New York City, we have Local Law 97, which mandates emissions caps for large real estate buildings, and or else you will pay a financial penalty each year if you don't comply. And so that, again, necessarily really just like forces these building owners and operators to take a hard look at their energy usage and emissions and make adjustments. And so that creates opportunities for companies like Carbon Lighthouse that you see on the slide here, who are using AI in pursuit of this. One of our portfolio companies I mentioned previously, Enertiv, is also playing into this market, and many other cities across the US and around the world are rolling out similar kind of building emissions ordinances. And finally, the macro context in the labor market and kind of the supply chain input markets as well is heightening the need for efficiency that tech can provide, right? So if you're building a giant infrastructure project of some sort and you see, the labor costs are going up, materials costs are going up, if if some application of AI can help you save a couple percentage points on some other part of your building process, that's going to be even more attractive now than it would be otherwise. So I think these are just really important structural factors that have all kind of combined to make the current moment. And then I want to highlight some interesting companies that we're seeing. And by the way, I want to start with a sort of disclosure here, a disclaimer here. I'm just highlighting these companies in almost all cases because I think they're interesting, not because we have a stake in them. I will call out when that is not the case. So for instance, I'm going to talk about Jacobs Technologies, which is one of our portfolio companies. But other than that, this is just sort of market research I'm highlighting. So I won't read off every single one off the page, but I did want to highlight a few. So in the built environment, Urbint is a really interesting early stage tech company. They have a model that incorporates many sources of external data like soil type, weather, demographic, economic conditions to basically serve utilities and other owners of large physical assets to proactively forecast damage incidents that would create damage for the physical asset as well as pose harms to worker safety. So this is just a great use of AI to forecast and generate ROI for asset owners by harnessing the power of your internal historical data combined with external data, and obviously get better over time as you learn. So Urbint has both received investment from and served as a client National Grid, which is one of the largest utilities in the U.S. Moving down here, so on the mobility in the mobility sector. Lacuna is an interesting company that is helping that empowers cities to digitally manage their mobility policy in the sense that cities need to roll out policies that are going to apply across different types of vehicles. So we have like bike shares, we have e-bikes, scooters, as well as ride sharing and everything. So Lacuna has a digital twin where cities can record, take in and record data, and then analyze that data and run policy kind of simulations and say what would happen if we said this part of our city was a no scooter zone or had a speed limit in this part. And so Lacuna kind of enables cities to run the simulations and then roll out and kind of dynamically change policies and then adapt in response to the feedback received. And they've also prominently partnered with the Open Mobility Foundation, which has created a uniform data standard, such that cities can receive standardized data from all these different types of mobility companies and integrate it into a model that's uniform and consistent. On the energy front, as I've mentioned, there's just so much tech innovation happening in the energy sector. Just to give one example here, Carbon Lighthouse is tapping into this both mandated, regulated, and just kind of financial ROI driven push to decarbonize buildings and make them more efficient. So Carbon Lighthouse deploys sensors to their building customers, which then constantly take in data with respect to lighting, temperature, airflow, just sort of everything that is physically happening in a building. Carbon Lighthouse is then able to generate forecasts for that building owner about how much they can save by making certain adjustments to save energy and reduce emissions. And they have so much confidence in their projections that they will actually write you a check for the difference if you don't save as much as they claim you're going to. And this apparently happens very, very rarely, like less than 1% of their total, I think, either customers or revenue or something like that. So they've got pretty good at, and then they are able to use their algorithms to sort of make continuous improvements at the building level, throughout the day, to make small tweaks that are going to have outsized impact in terms of a building's energy usage and emissions. So a couple interesting examples there. I'll then spend a little bit more time going through example of Jacobs Technologies at the bottom of the page here. As I mentioned, they're one of our portfolio companies, so I can sort of speak to them with a little bit more depth. So I will go to the next page here. So Deckard is a company that is in the kind of real estate tech sector, serving city and county governments. So they're tackling a really kind of socially compelling problem, which is that a lot of cities and counties have various regulations on, short-term rental properties, as well as property renovations, where property owners need to voluntarily pay, whether it's in the form of a transaction tax or a fee for a renovation. But cities don't have a great way of monitoring those properties in real time. So across the US, at least, local governments are missing out on probably tens of billions of dollars of revenue every year because they can't adequately monitor who exactly is renting out their home as an Airbnb and so on. So the folks at Deckard have built a really impressive AI-driven system that basically constantly crawls the web and archives data on nearly every residential property in the US, records that, and then is able to create a data as a service product for cities and other local government entities to help them comprehensively track, within their boundaries, who is renting out their property, who's made a renovation that they haven't pulled a permit for, and then automate the enforcement process as well. So you can actually, they can just have that local government basically send a letter to someone and say, hey, based on this listing that we've archived, we're pretty sure you're renting your property as an Airbnb. And so, if you then comply and start actually paying your taxes, all will be well. And so this is a kind of a great, positive return financial play from the perspective of a local government. They can capture lost revenue, fund vital public services without needing to raise tax rates. And then in terms of the AI component, I think this is a good illustration of one of the most compelling uses of AI, which is to kind of use a dynamically updating and learning algorithm to reduce the potential for human-driven discrimination and bias in some complex process. So using the Deckard tool, you will drastically lower the chance that within a certain jurisdiction, homeowners of a certain race or other group are going to be disproportionately targeted for enforcement. So, and there's a lot of, in a very, very, very similar area, there's a lot of research accumulating about how home valuations, which obviously property tax rates are applied to, have racially disparate outcomes. So Deckard is rolling out across the US. I have just very examples here, but they're working in many municipalities and counties. California is a very prominent market for short-term rentals, and so there are a few public announcements here from some local governments in California that Deckard has partnered with. So then to kind of zoom out a little bit and set us up for a broader group discussion. Wanted to kind of reflect on a couple sort of patterns and kind of trends we're seeing, as well as the kind of risks and levers that the public sector can think about. So first, as I think each of the examples I walked through sort of highlights, AI has great potential to just bring enormous level of analytical sophistication to sort of complex processes happening in cities in the built environment, to basically make life better, reduce discrimination, to sort of make our cities more prosperous and fairer places, which is something I personally care really deeply about, and is really core to our firm's investment thesis as well. However, there are obviously some serious risks that we need to think about when deploying AI that is going to be making decisions and removing the sort of active involvement of humans in some process. So one very prominent issue that's been covered a lot, and there's been a fair amount of legal and kind of regulatory action taken on, is the way that fundamentally using historical data for some future looking process can bake in historical sources of discrimination, and so that's why there's been some action on hiring, which is a little bit outside of the urban context, but sort of hiring algorithms and what should be included or not included or disclosed, as well as issues around ownership and data privacy. So the White House recently, just earlier this fall, released a document titled "The Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights," which is just like a white paper released by the White House. It's not any formal government policy or regulation, but it sort of contains some principles that could inform the way we think about regulating AI, and sort of I have a link here, and you can just Google it and check it out. And my read of it is that these are the document lays out five principles around ensuring that AI is safe and effective, ensuring that it's free from algorithmic discrimination, ensuring that data privacy is respected and is at a sufficient level, ensuring that consumers and whoever is affected by some algorithm have noticed that of that activity, and ensuring that there's where practicable a sort of human alternative option if desired by a certain consumer. And so these principles at a high level are compelling. It's not laid out in a ton of specificity in terms of like how this ought to be applied in specific cases, but my view is basically the local governments, cities and state governments are a good unit of government at which to experiment with different types of regulation and regulatory schemes. There have been a couple prominent examples recently that I just wanted to highlight. So there's the California Privacy Rights Act, which is going to effect in 2023, was made law through a ballot initiative in 2020. And so California is taking a very disclosure first sort of approach, basically saying that consumers and employees of businesses need to be notified that they are subject to some AI-driven system. And then there's here in New York City, there's local law 144, which relates to hiring algorithms specifically. But I think it's an interesting example of a city government unit taking a pretty definitive action with respect to a type of AI. So hiring algorithms, basically companies need to disclose to prospective to applicants that they're using a hiring algorithm and what factors are going into it. And those algorithms also need to be subject to regularly occurring like bias audits, which presumably the company would get an independent consultant to sort of verify that it's not going to be unfairly biased against certain groups. So I think those are examples of state and local governments rolling out and experimenting with regulation along the lines of what the White House is kind of advocating for here. So just a couple thoughts to kind of get us moving toward discussion. And so yeah, gonna kind of move to wrap up there, and really eager to hear what's on folks' minds. I'll just say from my end at least, obviously, we primarily invest and look at the U.S. market for these technologies. I know this group and this initiative is quite global in nature, so I personally am just really curious to hear about how some of this resonates in terms of the different verticals I've talked about or applications with what you're all seeing in the different regions where you're active. So yeah, thanks again, Hubert and Anthony, and glad to be here today.
Thank you so much, Paul. Make sure I'm not muted. Yeah. Super interesting discussion. Lots of great examples. I love the name for Deckard. If anybody remembers from Blade Runner, Rick Deckard was basically the bounty hunter who was going after the replicants. So the idea of using AI to help cities enforce, the policy and the regulations they have in place, I think is one where we see just tremendous alignment, and I think is something that ought to develop quite rapidly. I guess a big question I had for you was just to get things rolling, and people, please raise your hands if you have a question or submit them in the chat. It seems like there's almost in many ways like, the facial recognition bans are very reactive, right? that there's kind of a misalignment of expectations at the municipal level with the reality of AI. Facial recognition developed a lot faster with a lot more harmful effects than expected, whereas say something like automated vehicles has developed much more slowly with a lot less utility than expected or promised. And I guess the big question is like, building on these efforts we're seeing at the state and local level to try to at least, I think, set some principles, in a few cases, some specific laws. How do cities do, and like the sort of governance of cities, all of the people that help shape policy, how do they do a better job setting and managing the expectations, whether it's around the opportunities or the risks of AI?
Yeah, that's a good question and a good point in terms of prominent examples maybe distorting regular people and or including policymakers kind of expectations of technology. I guess one way to do it is to it's maybe a sort of trade-off, which is entailed in kind of being reactive and sector specific. Is like, if a technology like facial recognition or something is developing and has harmful effects, maybe it'd be better to be slightly more ahead of it rather than purely reactive. But you can think about that sector specifically, and not sort of like create some broader reaching scheme that's going to stifle tech development in another space where the tech is earlier on and would be less societally harmful. So perhaps cities, sort of drawing on or collaborating a little bit more proactively with the tech community, in their region, and thinking about what specific applications of AI are, need or about to need some sort of regulation, and not being overly broad, something like that.
We had a couple of questions from Hubert, which you might want to pop up and ask yourself.
Let me check that out. So,
Hubert, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
No, I had sorry, Paul. No, I had several questions actually. So the first one, it was related to your first slides when you explained that basically AI is not as widely used in urban environments than in other areas, which is also true in Europe. And I was wondering if it was for kind of financial or business model reasons for you.
I see. I saw the question. I was like, I thought that's the slide. It was where you asked it. I think that is almost certainly true in the sense that as a tech company selling a product or service, even if you're not selling, first of all, there's like B2G. Like if you are selling an AI-driven tech product to government entities, in general, that is quite difficult. Just in the same way that like selling technology to government is always difficult, but especially if it's like a little different, kind of new, you're not just like a substitute for some other contractor or service provider. And I guess that applies to sort of the gov tech sector more broadly. As well as companies that are not selling to government but are selling B2B or B2C, but are just more heavily regulated because of the sector they're in. So I think that has been true, and I'd say the reason we are more optimistic about the space right now is because of the changing priorities and changing priorities of governments around the world and funding levels. So like things, applications of technology that have to do with kind of climate and resiliency, the fact that the national grid example, like I think I happen to think National Grid is one of the more forward-thinking utilities in our country, but utilities in general have historically been incredibly slow-moving, kind of culturally, or in terms of business culture, kind of conservative entities. But even they are getting wise to the notion that like climate change is causing real damage, and you need to have a solution to address that. So yeah, I think that is definitely true, and there are good reasons to think that the next decade will be different. Then your next question.
Maybe just when on this topic, Paul, because actually it's also interesting because we discussed it with several members from the urban AI community, and especially with Anna, with us in the audience today. And we was wondering, like, how do you localize technology, and especially like what is the role of investment in localizing technology? Like, do we need kind of unconventional funding for such kind of very localized innovation? So it was just an idea we had, but I can see that we already have other questions in the chat, so I will let you answer them.
Let's see. So should we go to Chris's question? So let me see.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of a question about oversight, right? So I think one of the most interesting things about your presentation is this subtext of like regulation structures markets in ways that allow you to invest and innovate, right? So regulation opens markets, but it can also close them off in certain ways. And you know, how do we manage that and make sure that AI companies are behaving, you know, in the way that we have decided they should behave?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to the so being able to take that example of autonomous food delivery robot knocking, really sounds just really tragic and sad, knocking someone off the curb, and just more broadly kind of similar vehicles or uses of technology. I mean, it is sort of one of those, accountability is one of those things that is really simple but not easy, in the sense that you can pass some city level, state level, whatever, you can pass some regulation saying what you want, what standards you want to hold companies to, but governments need to actually allocate the resources and have people in government who have the sophistication and understand how these companies work to carry that out. So that is simple but not easy to do, I guess, in the sense that you do need to be measuring and constantly monitoring what are the levels of vehicle fatalities or whatever the right metric is, and as well as kind of a continuous kind of a continuous democratic process, not just passing regulation once and considering it over with, but ensuring that in whatever whatever local context you're operating in, the the mayor's office of whatever it might be called in the local context, but whatever kind of technology on local government exists is proactively seeking out residents and community members' feedback and thinking about how to update and respond, because technology and social context are sort of both constantly always evolving together. So,
and one of the interesting things about Deckard, I'm totally fascinated by this company.
We are too.
In a sense, like, it's cities deploying their AI to push back against Airbnb's AI, right? Which is managed to kind of frack these short-term housing markets by focusing, this incredible machine on reaching the people who are renting and, reaching the people who want to rent and making a match, and setting prices and creating trust and all this other stuff. I mean, I wonder, is that something? Are you guys sort of thinking about this at this level? Is this like, what are all the other flavors of that are out there?
I see. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good frame with which to think about Deckard. It's kind of arming local government entities with sufficient analytical horsepower to detect the activity of platforms like Airbnb, because in many cases they are not, in many cases Airbnb establishes a relationship with a homeowner or property owner, but does not automatically collect or transmit those tax payments. And I think in that same lens, you could consider Lacuna as well, because they're sort of enabling cities to kind of push back or hold accountable scooter companies who just like show up and then scooters everywhere.
But then cities responded with regulations that they couldn't actually. it's like cities' response to these earlier tech innovations, like they were good on paper, but they were not feasible in practice, right?
Right. Yeah, I guess we saw that with the sort of different kind of waves of like Uber versus cities kind of battles around the world, and ideally a technology like Lacuna or something in that vein where you can create like a uniform data standard. And I mean, and you do need some underlying kind of enabling regulation or legislation that forces the companies to play ball in a sense, because they have to, like, you need them to be mandated to give you the data to operate in your borders. So that has to happen sort of at the first level. But no, I think that's a really kind of that frame of like enabling governments to push back against some other powerful tech entity is a helpful one, and I think complements both the companies we look at and invest in and the ones on the page there fall into a couple of other buckets. A very common one is like serving the self-interest of some private sector entity as it is being regulated by a government entity. So like decarbonizing buildings is like, it's great to use AI to do that because you can do it really efficiently and not pay a penalty to the New York City government. And I think that in contrast to Hubert's question and our discussion about how hard it is to scale urban tech, those business models where it's like serving some B2B self-interest can be a very lucrative and rapid kind of go-to-market. And then, yeah, I mean, those two lenses, I think, capture quite a lot of the companies we had there. Yeah.
So Anna Castillo has a question about finance, and you pointed out in your slide that almost $1 trillion in U.S. federal spending on infrastructure. Yeah. There are a lot of people that want to invest in things that have a positive climate impact. Do you think that, like, so the question is twofold, like, how is the money coming in for urban AI? Who's it from? Where is it going to? And then, like, what is the impact or the opportunity or the challenges of sort of directing some of this federal infrastructure spending to things that are not made out of concrete, things that are smarter than that?
That is that's a very pressing set of concerns. So in terms of to think about the funding from the different programs in the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously it's kind of program by program, but I would say a very large percentage of that funding, I don't know what the actual percentage is, but based on like the programs I've reviewed, it's like probably somewhere around, I don't know, like 3/4 is like either physical projects that are rolling out sort of tech in the sense of like physical assets or technology that's already been proven to exist and just scaling it up. So it's like, if you have like a tax credit for project finance is not really applicable to the kind of technology we're talking about. Likewise for EV charging stations and so on. So a lot of it is like physical construction of projects, and then a lot of the grants are for like kind of hard tech, deep tech development. There are probably some programs that might be applicable to kind of what we're thinking about in terms of urban, gov tech, urban AI. I tend to think it's more the second order effect of the companies that are eligible to apply for those funds themselves want to show that they will use those funds really effectively, and so would become customers of. Imagine if you're if you're an EV charging company and you want to get some of those federal dollars to run your own services as effectively as possible, you would want to then purchase or maybe innovate in-house like some software platform that will help you coordinate across your different charging stations and sort of like dynamically adjust charging schedules and so on and so forth. And so I sort of think of that crowding in process rather than these types of kind of AI companies specifically getting the actual funding themselves. if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So
Yeah,
I mean, what you're saying is it'll be up to sort of the infrastructure vendors to bring the AI in to the proposals that they're advancing with cities. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's not a like I don't think that degree of removal is all that indirect, because a lot of the technologies we're talking about just directly increase the ROI of a particular like more hard infrastructure or asset operator. But yeah, it's kind of that chain of causation.
Interesting. Well, we're at time. I see one other question, which I'll ask that Hubert shared. Basically, like, how does the landscape look post Sidewalk Toronto? And I'll pile on to that and say, you know, as the whole investment landscape is shifting very rapidly, and sort of the tech sector is starting to go through some consolidation and contraction in some places. What's the next 12 months look like for you guys?
Yeah, so I think, so to take, I guess, a couple parts of that question. So first, in terms of like the reference to the Sidewalk Toronto project, I guess we could have a whole session or many sessions about that project. Obviously, a lot of ink has been spilled, but one takeaway that I sort of that applies to sort of like what I've discussed today and how I would think about the next 12 months is like that is a very capital intensive, like, I mean, the scale of what the pilot would have been was relatively small, but like in the sense of it was like a mega project in the sense of like the number of different functions or things that were going to happen in one neighborhood. And I think, a lot of the companies I've talked about and the ones we look at are like using technology, whether it's AI or something else, to get really, really good at one process in a specific sector for a certain customer entity, which is sort of different from like a full AI powered city in a box. And I guess that relates to how I would think about the next 12 months, which is that we at least have just been seeing in the context of the broader market, sort of tech private market slow down over the last several months. I think climate innovation is one really bright spot where I have noticed no downturn, if anything, acceleration in the sort of frequency and number of really interesting, innovative companies I get to meet on a weekly basis. So we're really excited about several of the sort of climate-related investment theses that I mentioned before, in particular, the way that software and AI can enhance the coordination and kind of dynamic adjustment of energy markets at all levels, because we've got the funding from the federal government. We've also just got the global events and massive fluctuations in energy prices, kind of causing a need for energy efficiency. So that's something that's really we're seeing a lot more, a higher kind of frequency and just like a lot of interesting companies. Let me see if there are any other kind of no, Chris Decker's name was a deliberate reference. I'm really glad that people on this call appreciated the reference, because it goes over a lot of people's heads. But it's in a tech kind of tech heavy audience. You're going to get that. Hubert, let me see here. Yeah, that's interesting that you're kind of seeing similar trends in your.
Yeah, I mean, this was my impression of Sidewalk is they bit off more than they could chew. The future sort of ran away from them, and they couldn't keep up with it. So it's definitely a lesson for everybody that is thinking big. You got to break the problem down into smaller pieces. Well, I want to thank Paul Healy again from Commonweal Ventures for your time and your thoughts. Next week we will be turning back to the hardware of cities and talking with Philip Purnell from the University of Leeds about AI-driven solutions for self-repairing cities. So I hope to see everyone there. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good one.